This is the second part of my series called An Independent Scholar's Manifesto. I already talked about what I mean by independent scholarship on a broad level. This video and the next two will explain three types of independence that the independent scholar cultivates: institutional independence, intellectual independence, and financial independence. This video will focus on institutional independence. I recently read a piece in The New Yorker about academic fraud scandals in behavioral psychology. The fraud is disturbing in its own right, but the following sentence caught my attention because it captures the absence of independence that seems endemic to some parts of academia. The context of the sentence was a description of the experience of a former PhD student. The student's dissertation had criticized the research of a senior professor whose work was later found to contain fabricated data, so the criticism was just. The PhD committee, however, informed the student that they would not sign off on her dissertation unless she removed the criticism of the senior professor. I quote now from the article. In an email, the advisor wrote, "Academic research is like a conversation at a cocktail party. You are storming in, shouting, 'You suck.'" The point of the advisor's email was that the PhD student was not to criticize the work of the senior scholar, because this was improper etiquette for the cocktail party called academic research. I must admit that I never experienced anything like this during my time in academia. My advisor and my dissertation committee offered me an incredible amount of latitude in my work, and they evaluated the results of that work with a great deal of integrity. But retrospectively, I can also see how the academic system as a whole is less meritocratic, less objective, less scholarly, and more like a cocktail party than I previously realized. This fact alone should prompt us to ask whether academia is the best place for scholars and scholarship. Institutional changes are making that question more urgent. I think there was a time, several decades ago, when it might have been possible for a larger number of individuals to cultivate a meaningful intellectual life within academia. That time appears to have passed. I am doubtful that it will return anytime soon. There are undoubtedly pockets of vibrant intellectual life that remain. If you find one of those pockets, then by all means you should pursue it and enjoy it. But if, like me, you entered academia because you wanted an intellectual life, if you put in the work, earned a PhD, and are less than satisfied with the available options, then I think you should cut your losses and leave as soon as possible. This is not because you're giving up on your intellectual vocation, but because you care too much about that vocation to sacrifice it to institutions that have other priorities or that simply cannot support it. I don't say this to be vindictive or petty now that I find myself on the outside of academia. I say it because I think higher education in the United States is going through tectonic changes that will render it increasingly inhospitable to genuine intellectual life. Let me offer a few reasons in defense of this thesis. First, in a significant number of cases, the return on investment for a university education no longer makes sense. Tuition has increased dramatically due to losses of public funding and other reasons I don't fully understand. In many cases, jobs that require a university degree no longer justify the cost of acquiring that degree. Professors in the humanities sometimes lament that undergraduates no longer care about knowledge for its own sake and are excessively pragmatic in how they approach their college educations. But I cannot blame students for being pragmatic. Pursuing knowledge for its own sake is an admirable ideal, but not when it means taking on tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. One analysis suggests that about a quarter of college degrees in the US result in a net financial loss for the student relative to their lifetime earnings. I would not be surprised if that number continues to rise. On the other hand, it is possible to earn non-university qualifications that offer an excellent return on investment. The lifetime earnings of an electrician with a high school education might be lower than those of an investment banker, but the return on investment, not to mention the quality of life, might be higher. I think more and more of the college-aged population will connect the dots and decide not to go to college. Return on investment aside, the universal availability of high-quality online content of all varieties renders many colleges and universities obsolete. Now, almost anyone can take computer science courses or other courses at Harvard using the edX platform. Massive open online courses, along with extensive YouTube material on every subject imaginable, have rendered the practice of listening to a professor in a large lecture hall almost entirely irrelevant. This obsolescence will be a further source of declining enrollments. Third, the demographic cliff caused by lower birth rates during the Great Recession will be another source of declines in university enrollments beginning in 2025. As enrollments drop, some institutions will fold, while many others will need fewer instructors. The result of these combined changes will be an ongoing decline in the need for faculty members, a smaller number of elite institutions, and a much smaller number of PhDs than was previously needed. Fourth, universities are losing credibility as reliable producers of knowledge for several reasons. One reason is the replication crisis in the social sciences. Replication of scientific results is at the core of the scientific method. A significant number of studies in the social sciences, some of which had become famous or influential, have simply failed to replicate. The large number of failures has caused a broader crisis in the social sciences, especially in psychology. The replication crisis has been fueled in part through a second crisis, which is the academic fraud crisis I mentioned previously. Academic fraud has reached the highest levels of the most prestigious universities in figures like Claudine Gay and Francesca Gino of Harvard. Studies are not only failing to replicate, it has been discovered that the reason for that failure has to do, in a significant number of cases, with fabricated or manipulated data. Universities are also losing credibility because of ideological conflicts. These conflicts are often between conservatives who increasingly criticize universities for being mere advocates of a woke ideology and the left-leaning members of those same universities. I have no interest in weighing in on this debate, but combined with the replication crisis and the academic fraud crisis, declining enrollments, and the obsolescence of the university as a technology for disseminating information, these ideological conflicts seem to put universities in a deeply precarious position. I suspect that some black swan event will cause the entire house of cards to come crashing down at the most unexpected time. If you don't know what a black swan is, I would recommend the book of Nassim Nicholas Taleb by that title. So what are the implications of these changes for scholars? I would suggest that anyone with a PhD will increasingly be forced to choose between several options. One option is to keep chasing the tenure track. Achieving success in this arena will increasingly mean becoming the equivalent of an academic rock star. For most, I don't think the sacrifices required to pursue this option will be worth it. I think the pressures required to succeed on this path will only aggravate the problems of academic fraud that I discussed a moment ago. A second option will be to accept an ancillary role in the academic rock star's orbit as an adjunct instructor or an administrator. Perhaps there will be a few for whom these are viable options, but I don't think most individuals with a PhD aspire to either of these outcomes. For most, these options will be dead ends. A third option, which is the one I am recommending, is to leave the university system and to set out on one's own. I think there are bountiful opportunities for a meaningful intellectual life and for earning money as a scholar and teacher outside of academia. It's time to start forging a path for this to happen on a large scale. I also want to emphasize that this is not a consolation prize. Leaving the cocktail party is the first step toward true scholarly independence.